let's break down what players you need to be targeting heading into week 2 fantasy football on the waiver wire. We're going to go through all the running backs, all the wide receivers, all the quarterbacks, and all of the tight ends that should be out there available on the waiver wire that you guys need to add as we approach our second week of fantasy football for the season. For the purpose of today's video, I'll be mainly going over players that are less than 50% rostered. Wasn't the best week in terms of overall waiver wire potential, looking back to week 1 of last year where we had guys like Puka Nacua and Kyron Williams, but nonetheless, there are definitely players that you need to be considering adding to your bench as we move into the week. So let's not waste any more time. Let's break down the must-add waiver wire players for week 2. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season. Week 2 pick'ems will be going live throughout this entire week. And if you guys are new to Underdog Fantasy and you use promo code the catch, that link is down below. You sign up before Thursday night football. You're going to claim a free pick'em that's going to be Josh Allen over half of a total yard that you can pair with any other pick'ems on Underdog. And on top of that, you're going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 that you can use on Underdog. That's up to $1,000 in cash that you'll be able to use on Underdog. Promo code the catch, that link is down below. Let's hop into our waiver wire ads. All right, like I said at the beginning of the video, it's not really a crazy week overall for the waiver wire, and certainly not a crazy week necessarily for running backs. We got mostly what we expected out of the running back position this week, but a couple guys to go over here. Let's start with J.K. Dobbins of the Chargers. He's sitting at 59% rostered, but I did want to talk about him because he is a player who might be available like in 10-team formats, things like that. And if, even if you're in a deeper league and he's available, I definitely think he's worth picking up at this point. As the week went on, I told you guys, like, I'm getting worried about Gus Edwards. I think J.K. Dobbins is going to be a bigger part of this game than we might be anticipating. And some people went into week 1 anticipating that, but I was on the Gus bus train. And, Gus Edwards, 11 touches, 1 reception off of 1 target, just 26 yards on the ground. And then when we flip over to J.K. Dobbins, had 3 targets, 3 receptions, 4 total yards. But I mean, those 3 receptions still help in PPR. But more importantly, 10 rushing attempts for 135 rushing yards, 13.5 yards per catch, and a touchdown, a double-digit performance at 22.9 points in full PPR. If Dobbins is out there, he looks like the better running back in this backfield. The touches overall still close, so I don't think Gus Edwards is out of this equation for sure. But in week 2, at the Carolina Panthers, one of the worst run defenses in the entire NFL, who just got scorched by the Saints, J.K. Dobbins needs to be on rosters moving into week 2. If he's out there, he's a top waiver priority add at the running back position. Next up, we've got Justice Hill, a player that I drafted a lot in the offseason in terms of a handcuff, but I don't know if he needs to be a handcuff to be relevant. We saw that in week 1's first game. But I will say, you get 8 targets, 6 receptions, 52 receiving yards for Justice Hill. You take that out of the equation, there's nothing to talk about here. He had 1 rushing attempt for 3 rushing yards. Like, he's being utilized in the passing game. He finished with 11.5 fantasy points. So I definitely think, in terms of a handcuff behind Derrick Henry, Justice Hill is worth picking up. But on top of that, Lamar Jackson showed some trust between him and Justice Hill in this game. Lamar Jackson was looking to dump the football off to Justice Hill a lot. I don't necessarily know if they're going to be as under pressure in week 2 against the Raiders, but we will have Max Crosby out there. So certainly, there's a potential for it. And then in week 3, they get the Cowboys with Micah Parsons out there. So, Kansas City did a really good job of getting pressure on Lamar Jackson. He was able to scramble out of most everything, but he was dumping the football off to Justice Hill a lot in this game. 8 targets, 6 receptions. I definitely think he is worth rostering as we approach week 2. Then kind of moving into 2 guys who were reviewed once again as pure handcuffs moving into week 1. We saw 12 touches for Tank Bigsby, who's 11% rostered, and he did pretty good with those 12 touches, 73 total yards. And on the other hand, Travis Etienne does 12 touches as well, 44 yards, but he got the touchdown. And he was, the running back used in the receiving game in terms of 3 targets and 2 receptions. So, 6.8 yards per carry for Bigsby, 3.6 for ETN. They get the Browns next week. That Browns defense did not look as stout at home in week 1. So Bigsby, ETN, maybe we are getting a split here as rumored in the preseason. We'll find out, but he's definitely worth rostering for now. And then Bucky Irving, 9 touches, 62 total yards, 6.89 point yards per carry, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 14 receiving yards. Rachaad White still had 15 rushing attempts and 6 targets in this game. Rachaad White is still the RB1 here, but, Rachaad White had 16.6 fantasy points. For all you Rachaad White haters, yes, he had 10.7 yards per carry on the ground. He's just so good in the ball in his hands in the receiving game that he's still the RB1 here. But the efficiency was not great, and the efficiency for Bucky Irving was much better. They get the Lions next week, not a great matchup, but they had the Broncos in week 3. So I don't know how much Bucky Irving will see next week, but he definitely, when he got involved in week 1, looked explosive, looked good. But I think Rachaad White, with the ball in his hands in open field, also looked good. So I think we'll still get a blend of these two guys, if anything. I think this game against Detroit's going to be a lot more competitive. So we'll see. I'm not going to go crazy about Bucky Irving right now, but he's definitely a good handcuff and deserves to be rostered moving into week 2. All right, moving along to wide receivers. Let's start with Alec Pierce. We went into this matchup, or at least I went into this matchup looking at guys like A.D. Mitchell. We knew Josh Downs wasn't going to play. A.D. Mitchell did absolutely nothing in this game, essentially 5 targets, 1 reception, 2 receiving yards. We also had Ashton Dolan in the same game, had 12.4 fantasy points, but that was off of 1 target, 1 reception, a 54-yard receiving touchdown. So, maybe keep an eye on Dolan as well. And now, don't get me wrong, Alec Pierce only had 3 targets in this game, but it just kind of felt like there was some sort of special chemistry between Anthony Richardson and Alec Pierce in this game. That touchdown to Alec Pierce was one of the best throws I think I saw maybe all of week 1. But yeah, 3 receptions, 125 receiving yards, 41.6 yards per catch, and a touchdown. Don't get me wrong, we see this a lot like early in the season, week 1, week 2. There's this wide receiver who pops up in the offensive game plan out of nowhere and scores 1 or 2 touchdowns, and then maybe they're not as efficient as the season goes on, or they just end up doing nothing. But for now, Alec Pierce, who's sitting at 12% rostered, yeah, I think he deserves a waiver wire priority as we approach week 2. Moving on to Randall Robinson, who's sitting at 11% rostered. I know this was a really bad offensive day for the Giants, but at the end of the day, Randall Robinson, pretty good fantasy day in full PPR. He had 11.8 fantasy points. Comparison, Malik Neighbors had 11.6, so pretty close here, but 12 targets for Robinson, 6 receptions, 44 total receiving yards. They were playing from behind. The Vikings defense definitely showed up, but that secondary is still weak. Nonetheless, they get Washington in week 2. Awful defense, awful secondary. There should be definitely room for Robinson to get close to double digits again. And I think when we look at this offense, while they're definitely not going to be good with Daniel Jones at quarterback, they have an opportunity in week 2 to once again score some fantasy points. So I think Robinson's certainly worth rostering. Let's look at 2 of the Cardinals wide receivers. We got Greg the Dortch coming in at 12% rostered, and then Michael Wilson on the other hand coming in at 18% rostered, excuse me. So Greg Dortch had 8 targets, 6 receptions, 47 receiving yards. Then Michael Wilson, 2 targets, 1 reception, but he turned one of them into a touchdown. For some reason, Marvin Harrison Jr. was only targeted 3 times in this game. And then Trey McBride had 9 total targets. So I don't know exactly how this Cardinals wide receiver room, pass catchers are going to work out here, but we saw 11 fantasy points for Greg Dortch. And although Michael Wilson had under double-digit fantasy points, he still scored a touchdown. Michael Wilson was a player I talked about as a last-minute waiver wire ad going into the week that I liked. So they get the Rams in week 2, then Detroit, then Washington. We have some competitive games coming up here, some weaker secondaries. So definitely keep an eye on both these guys, especially if you're in deeper leagues. I do think that for the time being, they deserve roster spots, but don't be surprised if there's a little bit of volatility in that pass catching room for the Cardinals. And then moving on to a kind of surprise name here, we've got rookie Devon Bell, who showed up in this game. There was some nice preseason coach speak, buzz around Bell. We hadn't really heard much of anything behind Cortland Sutton on this offense. I know Marvin Mims had a touchdown in the preseason, but what is this, wide receiver room going to be? Tim Patrick's gone. Jerry Jeudy, who we'll talk about in a second, gone too. So, but yeah, Devon Bell, 8 targets, 8 receptions, 39 receiving yards, 11.9 PPR points. Bo Nix looked like he had good chemistry with him. I talk about this a lot when you have a rookie quarterback, rookie wide receiver coming in the same year. You always want to pay attention to that. Kind of maybe early in the offseason, thought maybe Troy Franklin would be that guy since him and Nix played together in college, but he wasn't even active for week 1. Then Lil Jordan Humphrey had just 1 target in this game. So right now, Marvin Mims came out of this game also with just 1 target. So when we're looking at this receiving room for the Broncos, we had 12 targets to Cortland Sutton as expected, but then Devon Bell, the next highest amount of targets, and he finished as the highest scoring wide receiver on this offense in week 1. Don't love the matchup in week 2 against Pittsburgh. Then they get Tampa Bay, then the Jets. Maybe a little bit of a rough stretch here, but Devon Bell, definitely a player worth keeping an eye on, and potentially, especially in deeper leagues, worth a waiver wire add. Last wide receiver I want to talk about is Jerry Jeudy, who comes in at 61% rostered, so maybe not available in your league. But 8 targets in this game, only had 3 receptions. Pretty typical Jerry Jeudy stat line, but 25 receiving yards. And he did get a touchdown, 11.5 total fantasy points. The reason I want to talk about Jeudy primarily is because the Browns will face the Jaguars, the Giants, the Raiders, the Commanders, the Eagles, and the Bengals the next 6 weeks. So a lot of poor secondaries, a lot of good offensive matchups here. At the end of the day, Jerry Jeudy, maybe is going to be a guy who we can end up flexing. I don't know if I want to trust him, but like I said, 8 targets in this game. That was just 1 less than Amari Cooper, who had 9 targets. Elijah Moore had 6 targets. Cedric Tillman had just 1 target. So ultimately, he is playing at the moment through week 1 as a true wide receiver 2 here, and at least walked away with a touchdown. I do think there's going to be some opportunities. As bad as the Browns looked overall in this game, there's going to be some opportunities in the next coming weeks for Jerry Jeudy to potentially score and be worth a waiver wire addition moving into week 2. All right, last of all, let's look at some quarterbacks and tight ends. And if you guys watched last week's last minute waiver wire ads on Saturday, I told you guys the quarterback I want you to target is Baker Mayfield because he's going to ball out against an awful Washington Commanders defense in week 1 at home. That's what he did. 29.6 fantasy points, 4 passing touchdowns, 289 passing yards, 21 yards on the ground. They get the Lions in week 2, then the Broncos, then the Eagles. We got, for the most part, weak secondaries coming up in the next coming weeks. Talked about this all off season. Baker Mayfield, one of my most drafted quarterbacks in Underdog throughout the off season. He was a QB 10 last year against these weaker defenses. He is a player you can trust and start in fantasy football. I know he's a little bit higher rostered than every other quarterback we're going to talk about today, but especially in Superflex double quarterback leagues, he has to be rostered. If you have Jordan Love as your QB1, there's no one out there, but Mayfield's out there. Grab Baker Mayfield if you're playing with a more volatile QB1 who's maybe a little bit injury prone, whether you want to view Anthony Richardson or Jaden Daniels that way, maybe a Tua, however you feel about it. Maybe you just punted the position. You came out of your draft with like Trevor Lawrence and Kirk Cousins, who were both extremely disappointing in week 1. Baker, money, Mayfield is definitely worth a roster spot moving into week 2. Let's talk about a couple lower tier guys who are maybe more panic moves. Maybe you own Jordan Love, you got nothing out there. Maybe you're in a super flex league, double quarterback league. Let's just talk about these guys. Justin Fields is currently 24% roster, no touchdowns, did not run for any touchdowns, did not pass any touchdowns. A baller day for the kicker position. And Chris Boswell looking at the Steelers, but ultimately Fields also, he had a fumble, didn't lose it, but for the most part, didn't make any mistakes in this game, didn't throw any picks. They're on the road at Denver in week 2. Don't know if I love this matchup. Don't know if I'm okay with it, but at the end of the day, I think Fields is probably going to stay the starter for the Steelers. We'll find out. They do have a pretty decent stretch in the next coming weeks. Broncos, Chargers, Colts. We'll find out. We'll see more of Fields, I believe. He looked good in this system. Like I said, didn't make any mistakes. I think as things goes on, at least what we know from week 1 is that Fields can still run the football at 57 total rushing yards, 4.7 yards per carry. So for the most part, a lower tier add here, a double quarterback league add, but at the end of the day, Justin Fields might be worth a waiver wire addition. Then we'll talk about Derek Carr, who comes in at 14% roster and ended up being a sneaky start in week 1, 21 fantasy points, 3 passing touchdowns, 200 yards through the air. The Saints absolutely decimated the Panthers. I don't quite know for sure in week 2 at Dallas if we're going to see the same Derek Carr, but we might start to see a trend here. Once again, double quarterback, super flex. You're absolutely screwed in a deeper league because you only have Jordan Love as your starting quarterback. Carr, probably worth the addition. They'll face the Eagles in week 3, the Falcons in week 4, the Chiefs in week 5. It's a little bit of a tough stretch here, but at least at the end of the day, maybe they'll be playing from behind if there's nothing else better. Last quarterback we got to talk about is Sam Darnold. Once again, a low tier ad, double quarterback super flex ad, but Darnold looked good in this game. 24 passing attempts, 19 completions, 208 passing yards, 2 tutties, a pick, 3 yards on the ground. You're not going to start Sam Darnold in week 2 unless you're absolutely desperate because they're at home against the Niners. Then they get the Texans, the Packers, the Jets. There's going to be some opportunities here. Once again, this is a low tier ad for Superflex double quarterback leagues primarily, but Darnold looked good enough that he should at least be rostered. I think in 6-point passing touchdown leagues, he still had 18 fantasy points, so definitely not bad. Maybe the ceiling's not super high, but at the end of the day, Darnold at least a guy to consider. Moving on to the tight end position, everyone, if you're in free agent bidding leagues, I mean, everyone's going to be dumping into Isaiah Likely this week. If you're in a waiver priority league, whoever is number one waiver wire ad, I still think, even since Thursday night, it's been a couple nights to let this decompress, but I still think Isaiah Likely is going to be the most added player in fantasy football this week. 26 fantasy points in week 1, 12 targets, 9 receptions, 111 receiving yards, 12.3 yards per catch, 1 touchdown. Basically had 2 touchdowns on this game. Maybe could have, even the play before the foot was out of bounds, 2 plays before that, Lamar barely missed him when he was open. So, listen, I still think Mark Andrews is going to be heavily involved in this offense. I'm not panicking on Mark Andrews or anything, but we have to admit when Isaiah Likely filled in for Andrews at the end of last season, he was very, very good. When he played here in week 1, he was once again very, very good. Looked great with the ball in his hands. Looked like one of the best players on this entire roster easily. I think Lamar Jackson is going to continue to find ways to get him the football. He's got to be added. We've talked about this for a couple of days now. I don't want to spend too much time on it. He's probably the top added player in all of fantasy moving into week 2. Then let's talk about 2 low-tier tight ends very quickly. Both of these guys scored touchdowns. We'll start with Chicken Conquo. He gets the Jets next week. He's probably not going to score a touchdown next week. He's going to be touchdown dependent. You take away the touchdown, this game's not very good. But for those of you in deeper leagues, 16-team leagues, you punted the position, you drafted Luke Musgrave, you drafted Jake Ferguson, maybe you didn't necessarily punt the position, whatever, you're desperate. I think Chicken Conquo might have streaming capacity throughout the week. Once again, I don't know if it's going to be in week 2, but the Titans will face the Packers and the Dolphins in the next 2 weeks. So at least the next 3 weeks. So there's at least something there potentially. It looks like Will Levis at least trusted him in the red zone, but fortunately, when you're streaming tight end, you're probably going to be mainly looking at touchdown dependency. And Juwan Johnson had a touchdown against the Panthers in week 1, 3 targets, 2 receptions, 26 receiving yards, and 10 fantasy points. We definitely saw a lot of usage out of Taysom Hill as well, but not really in the receiving game. So I think that's still going to mainly lie with Juwan Johnson. But don't get me wrong, Foster Moreau looked pretty okay in this game too. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 43 receiving yards, 14.3 fantasy points, and a touchdown. So if you want to stay away from Juwan Johnson, I'm okay with that, but he's only rostered in 6% of leagues. And I ultimately feel like I like Juwan Johnson more, but like I said, Foster Moreau had a pretty dang good game as well. But this is a deep, deep ad if you're just struggling at the tight end position. Not a lot of tight ends to really pull from after week 1. We'll see who starts to emerge as we continue to move through the fantasy season. That'll do it for today's video. There are your week 2 waiver wire must adds for the 2024 fantasy football season. Like I said, not the best week overall for waiver wire additions. If anything major happens that leads to other additions in Sunday Night Football or Monday Night Football, I will drop a comment down below and pin those guys And while you guys are in the comments down below, make sure you guys let me know who you were targeting on the waiver wire moving into week 2. But of course, if you have any fantasy football questions, any format starts, sits, waiver questions, defensive streams, questions, trade questions, roster reviews, panic levels, whatever it may be, drop them down below. I will get back to every single comment on this video. If you guys enjoy the content or find it helpful today, be sure to subscribe on the way out. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, saw it here on the catch.